All right, thank you everyone for joining us. I'm Henry Florsham. I'm the President and CEO of the Wichita Falls Chamber of Commerce. I'm happy to be here at home base with our Senator Ted Cruz. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. And special thanks to Senator Cruz and his staff for being here. I'm going to give a brief overview of what we're going to do and who's on the call. Senator, we've got an eclectic mix of people in the audience today representing our manufacturing community, small business owners, government leaders, healthcare and mental health professionals, economic development partners, and many more. Here are some brief housekeeping rules for the audience. Everyone should remain muted during the call. Make sure that your first and last name are showing, and you can rename yourself if necessary. We will begin with comments by the senator, followed by question and answers. Some of you have already submitted questions. If you have not and you have a question for the senator, please post it on the chat. When it's time for questions, I will recognize you and unmute you. Then you can introduce yourself, the organization or company that you represent, and then you can ask your question. Due to time constraints, we may not be able to get to everybody's questions, but we'll do everything that we can. All right, Senator Cruz, thanks for joining us. The floor is yours.
Henry, thank you very much, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. I appreciate your taking the time. Ideally, I wish I were there in person. Anytime we have a crisis or catastrophe, I try very much to be there in person to hear directly from everyone impacted by the crisis. But obviously the nature of this pandemic makes large gatherings in person not advisable right now. And so I'm glad we can use the tools of technology to do this virtually. I'm doing a teletour all across the state, trying to hear from Texans who are impacted by the crises playing out, and to talk directly about the policy approaches we're taking to overcome those crises. We're in extraordinary times right now. We're facing three simultaneous crises in the state of Texas. We have, number one, a public health crisis, the coronavirus pandemic, the consequences of which have been extreme, and we have taken remarkable public policy steps to flatten the curve, to minimize and slow the spread of the virus. Secondly, we're facing an economic crisis, a catastrophe. Over 22 million Americans have lost their jobs just in the last 4 weeks. That's over 10% of the workforce nationally. We're seeing millions of small businesses that are on the verge of bankruptcy. We're seeing entire sectors of the economy that have been utterly devastated. And then third, in Texas in particular, we're facing an energy crisis. Oil and gas in the midst of this coronavirus pandemic, Saudi Arabia and Russia took advantage of this public health crisis to flood the world markets with oil, and it caused the price of oil to drop in half. That is putting enormous economic pressure on all of our Texas energy producers and threatening millions of jobs in the state of Texas. I can tell you all three of those crises are consuming virtually every waking moment in every day of mine. And I'm focused on the public policy responses we have to combat and defeat each of those crises. And I imagine we will discuss all of them in the course of this discussion. And really the purpose of this is for me to hear from you the challenges, the concerns you're facing. So let's open it up for questions and have a conversation.
All right, thank you, Senator. First up is a question from Bill Haley. Bill, if you can unmute yourself, and then you can address the senator directly.
Thank you, Henry, and thank you, Senator Cruz, and thank you for your service and your leadership. I appreciate it. My name is Bill Haley. I'm the plant manager of Vitro Architectural Glass here in Wichita Falls, Texas. And you hit on my question, good prelude. My question is, OPEC and the Russians, people that really like us, more than once have targeted our oil industry, putting our national security at risk, as well as putting many Texans and U.S. citizens out of work. I believe in free markets, but the OPEC cartel and the Russians fall far short of free market principles. I believe personally tariffs should be used to set a floor on the price of oil and also limit the oil coming into the United States. In line with capitalism, I still think this would force the weakest oil companies to exit, but would allow other companies to improve their profitability without going bankrupt. And we need a policy to keep this from happening again. It just happened. You're a leader that likes to mix it up. So What's your position, and what can you do to protect our industry?
Well, thank you very much for that question. You are right in terms of the scope of the problem and the threat. And here's what occurred. As the coronavirus epidemic was spreading globally and becoming a pandemic, Russia and Saudi Arabia decided to exploit that crisis, flood the global markets with oil, and use it to crater oil prices. And they used it really opportunistically to try to take out U.S. shale production, to take out their competitors. I can tell you in the last several weeks, I've had multiple conversations with the Saudis. Just on Saturday, I spent an hour and a half on the phone with the Saudi energy minister and the Saudi ambassador. And there are a total of 13 senators that have teamed up to do this together. We're all from major energy producing states, oil and gas states. All 13 of us have historically been strong diplomatic and foreign policy allies of the Saudis. And I got to tell you, these conversations have been as bare-knuckled and candid as any conversation I've ever had with a foreign leader in 8 years in the Senate. What I told the Saudis, and I've told them this repeatedly, I've said, listen, no state in the union does more business with Saudi Arabia than Texas does. And what y'all have done is exploited a global health crisis to declare economic warfare on the state of Texas, to try to bankrupt Texas energy producers, and that is altogether unacceptable. The Saudis' response to this was essentially, but Russia. And my response to that, I said, I don't give a damn about Russia. Russia is our enemy. They act like our enemy, and we treat them like our enemy. You're supposed to be our friend. If you want us to treat you like Russia, if you want us to treat you like our enemy, we can certainly pull up our soldiers and take them out of Saudi Arabia. We can pull the Patriot missiles out of Saudi Arabia, and the next time you get in hot water in the Middle East, you can just not bother to call the U.S. military. But you're not going to try to bankrupt energy producers throughout the state of Texas and jeopardize millions of jobs in the state of Texas. Now, I can tell you these conversations have been heard, have had a real impact. I think the Saudis were a little shell-shocked at the ferocity of the response. In my office, my national security advisor went through a whole series of steps to ratchet up pressure on the Saudis and have them pay a real price for their economic hostility. 2 weeks ago, Friday, I flew to D.C. and went to the White House to meet with the president. And to meet with the CEOs of major energy companies to talk about this. We spent 2 hours discussing the energy crisis, and a lot of the discussion focused on Saudi Arabia and Russia. The president, likewise, has been leaning in hard on the Saudis, been leaning in hard on Putin, and just this weekend, we got an announcement from them, from OPEC Plus, that they would reduce global production by at least 10 million barrels a day, potentially as much as 20 million barrels a day. That is a major pullback, and that is a result of hard diplomatic pressure from the group of senators and from the president. I think that is a positive development. Now, my attitude towards the Saudis is very much like Reagan's attitude towards the Soviet Union: trust but verify. And so I want to see the results of what they actually do, but the announcement at least was positive. Even if they follow through on this commitment, it's not going to solve the energy problem, because there's two things going on. One, you have the Saudi and Russian assault on energy, but number two, the coronavirus economic shutdown and freeze has had an even bigger impact on energy. If you look at it, prior to this crisis, global energy demand was roughly 100 million barrels a day. Today, we've seen demand destruction of anywhere between 25 and 35 million barrels a day. We're down between 60 and 70 million barrels a day. That's real simple. That's because our cars are parked in our driveways, nobody's driving, and nobody's flying airplanes. And until we get the economy moving again, until we get people driving their cars and trucks again and getting on jet airplanes again, oil and gas is going to be hurting mightily because demand has collapsed. And so it is intertwined. Hopefully we've stopped the Saudis and Russians waging economic warfare on us, but we've got to get demand back in order to see oil and gas be able to thrive and prosper.
Thank you, Senator. Next, we're going to go to Dave Toogood.
Oh, hey there. Thank you for your time. I just had a question a little bit about the N95 mask shortage. From my perspective, it's just a lot of mixed information from the media, whether there's a shortage, there's not a shortage, whether we can get them, whether we can't get them. I was wondering if you could speak to that just shortly.
It has varied. That initially there was certainly a shortage. It remains difficult, particularly in some areas, to get adequate PPE. I've worked very, very closely with Governor Abbott. I've worked very closely with federal agencies to make sure that we're getting protective equipment, particularly for our first responders and for our medical professionals. It still remains a challenge, and then there's a whole range of PPE. One of the things we've seen, obviously, is for individual citizens who are not healthcare providers, who are not first responders. A number of folks have been using masks, homemade masks, cloth masks, to minimize the risk of spread, but not necessarily the full N95 mask that has maximum effectiveness. One of the reasons for the limitations is an awful lot of the production of PPE occurs in China. And one of the things this crisis has really exposed is our vulnerability of our supply chain to China, especially for critical infrastructure, things like medical equipment, like PPE, and things like pharmaceuticals, life-saving medicines. Now, I have for a long time been leading the effort in the Senate to stand up to China, to resist their global aggressiveness and hostility. One of the effects, I think, of this crisis going forward, when we get out of the immediate pandemic, is I think an awful lot of people are going to reassess how on earth did we let America become so vulnerable. We saw the Chinese government, through a state-owned newspaper, threatening to cut off life-saving medications to the United States, things like antibiotics, things like blood pressure medicine, heart medicine. It is completely unacceptable, in my judgment, that American lives are dependent on the Chinese government, and they have the ability to threaten American lives that way. If they followed through on that, that wouldn't just be economic warfare. That would be actual warfare. That would be threatening the lives of Americans. And so I think we're going to see a very serious discussion in the weeks and months ahead about how to bring much of that supply chain back and make sure that we can get the critical medicines we need.
Next, we'll go to Jackie Hager.
Can you hear me, sir?
Yes.
I want to thank you very much. I have a two-part question. Word on, I guess word over on the street or social media today is that we're out of PPP funds.
Yes.
For extra businesses that didn't apply on time. I'd like to know what are the plans moving forward with that. And then the second part of that is, when is Texas especially going to step up and think about how we can help save the cattle business, the dairy farmers, and the ranchers?
Yeah. So two great questions. Let me take them one at a time. So Congress has passed three major relief bills in response to this crisis. The third bill, the CARES Act, passed a couple of weeks ago, is a $2.2 trillion relief bill. Had enormous bipartisan support. In the Senate, it was unanimous. Every Republican voted yes. Every Democrat voted yes. It was 96-0. So I voted for it. Bernie Sanders voted for it, to give you a sense of the diversity of views that was supporting this bill. By far, the most popular provision of the CARES Act was the PPP program. The PPP program is $350 billion in emergency guaranteed loans to small businesses, defined as 500 employees or fewer. Program is administered through local community banks and financial institutions. And these loans, to the extent that they are used for salary or paychecks, or rent or mortgages for the business, or utilities, are entirely forgivable. They become grants. And that applies, by the way, not just to current employees, but if in recent weeks a small business has laid off or furloughed employees because of the crisis, they can hire them back and their salaries are covered and forgivable under the loan proceeds. This program was designed to keep as many people as possible employed in their jobs, in the relationship with their small business employer, to keep them on their private health insurance, and to also keep a paycheck coming during this crisis. It has proven immensely popular. We've seen in excess of $30 billion a day of these loans being taken up and going out the door. By the way, the #1 state in the country for PPP loans as of the day before yesterday was the state of Texas. We had at the time about $22 billion of loans that had gone to the state of Texas. As of today, the fund has run out. So the $350 billion has been spent. Last week, Senate Republicans tried to replenish the fund, and we introduced legislation to add another $250 billion to the fund to meet the demand and the enormous enthusiasm. Senate Democrats blocked that bill. They stood up and they objected. And the reason they blocked it is they're trying to extort and demand other partisan objectives to replenishing the PPP program. This is following a pattern we saw in the CARES Act itself. You may recall when we took up the CARES Act, it had been negotiated as a bipartisan bill. Democrats and Republicans both were active participants in it. And at the last minute, Nancy Pelosi parachuted in and blew the whole thing up with this long list of partisan demands, delayed everything for 4 days. Ultimately, she receded and the partisan demands were not tenable. And we ended up passing largely the bipartisan bill that we had agreed to 4 days earlier. Here we're seeing Democrats doing the same thing. It's not that they oppose the PPP program. In fact, they're telling their constituents that they support it. They're enthusiastically in support of it. They're just holding it hostage to try to advance other partisan objectives. I think the matter will get resolved. I think it will prove completely untenable for Democrats to be shutting off the paycheck protection funds. But that's right now in active negotiation in Washington. And as we sit here today, the Democrats are still objecting. And so the loans are not going out right now because of the Democrats killing the program. I think they will relent, but they haven't yet. The second question in terms of agriculture, in terms of cattle, listen, ag is huge. Texas is a massive agricultural state. Whether cattle, whether cotton, farming, ranching, and we've seen commodity prices, we've seen livestock prices plummet during this crisis. Part of it is because global trade has largely has decreased dramatically during the pandemic, and so export markets are much more limited. Part of the CARES Act was $23 billion directed towards agriculture. And emergency assistance to farmers and ranchers. The U.S. Department of Agriculture is administering those funds right now. I've joined multiple letters to Secretary Perdue urging him to focus on Texas cattlemen and Texas cotton farmers and Texans who are experiencing devastating harms. And it's worth underscoring the approach of the CARES Act. I don't refer to it as a stimulus bill. It's not designed to be stimulus. It is instead an emergency relief bill. It is designed to give emergency relief to the people who are hurting because of these crises and hurting through no fault of their own. They didn't do anything to cause this. This is very different from the 2008 financial crisis, where many of the financial firms had themselves carried out misconduct that helped precipitate the crisis. In this instance, a cattle rancher didn't do anything to cause the coronavirus pandemic, and they shouldn't be punished for it. But I view these really as short-term bridge loans to get through the crisis, and the real solution for farmers, for ranchers, for small businesses, for oil and gas, for everyone is get the economy going again, get people back to work. And I am pressing very, very hard that we need to get people back to work and fight the coronavirus pandemic. But we can't, for weeks and months on end, just shut down the economy across the country. That has devastating harms to Texans as well.
Thank you, Senator. A couple of reminders to the audience. If you have a question to ask, please make sure that your name is visible so I can recognize you. And secondly, when I introduce you, remind the senator what company or organization you represent. Next, we're going to call on Darren Liker. Darren, let me unmute you. Darren, you're unmuted now.
Okay, I'll start over. First of all, I'm Darren Liker. I'm the Wichita Falls City Manager. Senator, I want to thank you for your time. It's very generous and we appreciate it. My question centers around the CARES Act that was passed. I believe there was about $150 million in coronavirus relief funds that allowed for direct funding to cities with populations of 500,000 or more. Now that left out all the cities less than 500,000, such as Wichita Falls. Do you see anything on the horizon that might change with that? I mean, obviously we're dealing with the health crisis, but what's really keeping me awake at night is the devastating economic crisis that we're going to be dealing with over the next couple of budget years. Thank you.
Sure. No, I certainly understand that. So part of the CARES Act, there were multiple pieces in the CARES Act. One component of the CARES Act was $100 billion for hospitals and healthcare providers. And another component of it, as you just referenced, was $150 billion for state and local governments. I mean, both of those are massive appropriations. And the way it is administered is for larger municipalities, and the test was 500,000 in population or more. That was a direct allocation. So big cities could receive that funding directly. For smaller municipalities like Wichita Falls, the money is intended to go to Wichita Falls. The money is intended to go to smaller cities, to smaller counties, but it's going through the state first. And so the state is receiving an allocation, and then it's the state that is responsible for distributing to the smaller municipalities, to the smaller counties, dependent on the need, those funds. And so you've got altogether $250 billion, $100 billion on the health side, and $150 billion on the state and local government side, and all of that is flowing out. But it's the state officials that are making the allocations for the smaller communities.
Thank you, Senator. Next, we'll go to Leanne Burnett.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So can you discuss, I'm the current Wichita Falls Association of Realtors Board President. So my question is directed in that light. Can you discuss the real estate economy and the impact that you're seeing on a state level? And could you also give some insight as to what we should be looking at towards our county and local government as far as protecting the real estate market while keeping the health and safety of our public as at the front of that equation?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question, and thank you for the work you do as a realtor. Real estate often is highly dependent on the rest of the economy and how the economy is going overall. I know a number of realtors who've continued to show homes, to do so in the Houston area in particular, doing so not in large groups, so not having open houses where you have a large group, but doing so with small gatherings. Obviously, people are more hesitant to go out and to look at a house or show a house at a time of public health crisis. And I think the other two crises, the economic crisis and the oil and gas crisis, both pose real threats to real estate. Look, to the extent people are facing losing their jobs and losing their savings and crushing economic threats, some of them will be forced to sell their homes. Some of them may lose their homes. That will result in some sales, but at the same time, it may limit the number of buyers who are there. I can tell you on the oil and gas side. So I'm a Houstonian. I grew up in Houston, and in the 1980s, 1970s, my parents owned a small business in oil and gas. It was a seismic data processing company. And in '86, when oil collapsed, worldwide, and it dropped to under $10 a barrel, it utterly devastated oil and gas across the state of Texas. And my parents, like so many others, went bankrupt. And so we lost the business. We lost our home. Our home was foreclosed on. We couldn't, our home was underwater where the mortgage was more than the value of the home. Because what happened in '86 is when oil and gas collapsed, it caused real estate values to plummet as well. And we ended up losing everything. And I was a junior and senior in high school when that happened, and went off to college with a situation where my parents couldn't pay anything to help cover the cost of college. And so I had to take loans. I worked 2 jobs in college. And so I've experienced firsthand the sort of the cascade of negative effects this economic devastation can produce. I think for the real estate market, like everything else, what is critical is we've got to get the economy moving forward. This week, both the president and the governor are laying out plans to get Americans working again. Now, those plans are going to have to be dependent on the facts and circumstances on the ground. They're not going to be uniform. They're going to be dependent upon the geographic circumstances that are faced. So, for example, New York City has had a devastating public health outbreak there. It's horrifying what has happened in New York City. No one in their right mind would suggest New Yorkers should go back to work tomorrow. But there are other parts of the country where the numbers, where the data are not nearly so bad, and we need to be guided by the medical science and the data. But in a number of regions of the country, I think it makes sense for the very vulnerable, either the very elderly or those with serious health conditions, to continue to be isolated, to continue to be quarantined, because those are the communities most at risk from coronavirus. But for young, healthy people to be able to go back to work, to be able to drive the economy, because this economic devastation produces real public health harms. That if you have millions of people losing their jobs, losing their savings, losing businesses that they poured a lifetime into, we know that is going to produce increased mental illness issues, increased depression, increased risk of suicide. We know that it's going to produce increased risk of alcohol abuse and substance abuse. All of those will cost lives. And I think the government response needs to be to protect life and to minimize the loss of life across the board. And so we need to fight the coronavirus pandemic, but at the same time, we need to mitigate the harms from economic devastation. And going back to work may well mean that we don't do exactly what we did 3 months ago, that there may be a time period, for example, where people wear PPE. Maybe for realtors, if you're showing a house, you wear a mask and gloves. Maybe that's true for customers that are going in to see a house. Maybe that's true for people. We already see people who are doing deliveries who are wearing masks and gloves. It may be true for restaurants that to open up, they have to reconfigure their dining room to spread the tables out further so we can social distance, that there are reasonable steps that can be taken to mitigate the risk, while at the same time enabling the economy to open up. That will be the best thing for the real estate market and for every other market as well.
Thank you, Senator. I'd like to go to Kelly Fristow.
Thank you, Senator, for all that you're doing. It's forecasted that commercial health insurance companies are going to be seeing claims exceed $250 billion. And this doesn't include any claims that are paid directly by the state or federal government through legislation, nor a large number of employers that are self-funded. And this is expected to result in insurance premiums having an increase of possibly over 40% next year. So this storm is going to result in a lot of people not being able to afford health insurance. It's going to create a level of affordability that we've not seen yet. What's being discussed there in Washington, D.C. as it relates to this particular issue, and how consumers and business owners are going to be able to deal with this issue next year?
Look, it's a great question, and it is a serious challenge. I would say that we're dealing with these issues in waves based on the immediacy and urgency of the challenge. So the first wave that we're dealing with is trying to keep as many people as possible employed and on their private health insurance plans. That as people lose their jobs and lose their health insurance, that's the worst thing to do potentially going into a pandemic. And so the Paycheck Protection Program is a great example of that, trying to keep millions of people with the job they have now and with the health insurance they have now. Moving forward in terms of lowering costs and lowering premiums, the most effective way to lower premiums, I believe, is to expand competition and expand options. And I've been pressing a whole host of both legislative and regulatory steps to lower cost and lower options, expand options rather, including one piece of legislation that I've reintroduced recently focuses on health savings accounts. Health savings accounts, as you know, let people save in a tax advantage way for healthcare needs. Right now, by federal law, they are narrowly limited. So the only people who can open a health savings account are people who have a high deductible insurance plan. And so most Americans, most Texans are not allowed to open a health savings plan. I have legislation that would let everyone open a health savings plan if you want, that would eliminate the bar for most people on doing that. That would be an additional vehicle to let people save in a tax advantage way to meet their healthcare needs. That has a positive effect of driving down costs in healthcare and allowing people to devote more resources to it. But the question you raise is going to be a real challenge, and one that policymakers in Texas and nationally are going to wrestle with in the months ahead and in the years ahead.
Okay, Senator, next, let's go to Bob Mayfield.
Okay, and I think I'm getting the hook for the next meeting, so I think we may have to wrap up with this question.
Okay.
Thank you, Senator. We appreciate all that you're doing. I'm a small business owner, I own a printing company, and we're trying to help our customers. Most of our customers are small businesses. And this is geared toward what can we do to help start opening up, and it's how can we protect ourselves with this virus. And I've got twofold. Can we get the CDC to issue some sound and practical and non-ambiguous guidelines for businesses? We've been doing a lot of research, and we see some CDC stuff, and OSHA and EPA has some information out, but a lot of that is geared to employers protecting employees. And we need to be able to find some affordable things for small businesses to be able to do and to be able to show the public that we are taking this seriously and how we're dealing with. And then the second part of that is, can we expect any legislation to help mitigate liability in the event that the public starts coming out and starts making frivolous lawsuits because they claim to have caught the virus at somebody's business?
Yeah, those are two excellent questions. On the first one, I think and hope this week in both what the president lays out and what Governor Abbott lays out, that you will see some clear guidance there. I've been working very, very closely. In fact, just an hour ago, I got off the phone with the president. He has appointed an advisory committee of senators to advise him on reopening the economy. And it's 24 senators. I'm one of the senators on that committee. So we just spent an hour talking with the president about precisely that and the guidelines. He's meeting with a number of governors right now and laying out federal guidelines. But then the governors are laying out state guidelines, and I expect there to be some clear guidance in terms of small businesses and how to safely approach reopening and in what circumstances. I would imagine that guidance will include things like the use of PPE, like social distancing, reasonable steps we can take to mitigate the risk of transmission. And CDC is part of the federal response, so I would fully anticipate CDC role having a significant role in what the president lays out today. The second question on liability is a very good question. I think there is a reasonable prospect of that happening as a matter of state law in Texas, although the legislature would have to come into session to do that. On the federal level, I'm far less optimistic. I think it would make sense to see some liability protection. That has been an issue across the board. It's been an issue, for example, getting manufacturers to make PPE, as they're afraid of getting sued if they make PPE and someone gets sick anyway, that they don't want crushing lawsuits. What we've seen in Congress is that congressional Democrats are not in favor of liability protection, that they want people sued, that they are heavily funded by trial lawyers, and they want to see a bunch of class action suits filed and filed against businesses, filed against anyone with the deep pockets to pay. And so with a Nancy Pelosi House and the ability of Democrats to filibuster in the Senate, I would be overstating it if I said there was a high prospect of liability relief on the federal level. I think there's a much greater prospect of it at the state level.
Senator, thank you very much for spending some time with the business community in Wichita Falls. To everyone that, if we didn't get to your question, please email it to me at henry@wichitafallschamber.com. We will forward that to the senator's staff and get some answers for you there. All right, Senator, we know you're busy. Hope you have a great day.
Well, thank you, Henry. Let me say two very quick things in closing, which is number one, to everyone on this call, thank you. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your leadership with your employees. Thank you for your leadership with your family. Thank you for your leadership with your community. It makes a big, big difference. And number two, just a word of encouragement. We're going to make it through this. These are extraordinarily challenging times, but Texans are strong and resilient, and Americans are strong and resilient. We've made it through huge challenges before. We made it through 2 world wars and the Great Depression. We made it through 9/11. We've made it through global health pandemics before, and we will come through this. We will defeat these crises, and we will do it by coming together, by uniting, by standing strong, and I'm proud to be standing with each and every one of you. Thank you for the difference you're making. God bless.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator.